Well, I guess I'll do an update on Cuba today. I was curious about what was going on in Cuba. I heard something about Joe Biden imposing sanctions, and so I decided to look it up. It doesn't seem like there's been a whole lot of new protests. It seems like it flared up there for about a week. Now, it might be that these are the internet restrictions and that we're not seeing a lot coming out of Cuba. There's not a lot of communication. But at the same time, even after they had that temporary shutdown of the entire internet and then just a shutdown of only social media, which I've been unable to find any stories about whether or not the social media website has been turned back on in Cuba. But there were still people getting stuff out. Even after they shut everything down, there were people finding ways to get some videos out of the country, and we were still seeing them. Now, I'm not seeing a whole lot. So I get the feeling that it's died down a little bit. This doesn't seem to be like a yellow vest situation in France, where the yellow vests were out every weekend, rioting in the streets, turning over cars, burning down buildings, demanding that Macron resign. And by the way, the yellow vests didn't get their way. But from what I've seen, if the Cuban uprising needed to intensify, not peter out. The Cuban regime is very strong. It's very authoritarian. A little blip like this is not going to destabilize them. It might set the groundwork for future counter-regime actions, but in and of itself, what I've seen does not appear like the Cuban government is about to collapse in on itself and be replaced by some new regime. I might look dumb, in a month or so or a few weeks, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think that this moment of an uprising against the government in Havana it's past its prime, and I think it's effectively over. I tried to look at a bunch of Cuban dissident politicians and other people on Twitter, like Marco Rubio or Carlos Jimenez, who have been pushing Cuba stuff and were retweeting a lot of these videos coming out of Cuba. And all I could find them talking about, which, by the way, they're talking about Cuba a lot less than they were, a week ago or 2 weeks ago. What I was able to find were them sharing videos of people in America protesting, which that is not going to have any implications for the government in Havana. These were essentially people protesting, trying to get Washington to do something about Cuba and to go down there and help topple the current guy. What's his name? Miguel Diaz-Canal. I almost said Mario Diaz-Balart, but that's a congressman here in Florida, and he's actually Castro's cousin, big anti-Castro guy. Or not his cousin, his nephew, I think. It's not Diaz-Balart. Diaz-Canal is the current Cuban dictator. Now, the sanctions themselves, which I guess I'll go over that briefly. Biden decided to sanction some individuals, people. I guess the head of the police, which in most third world countries we would refer to this as the interior minister. That's usually the guy who runs the centralized police force. A lot of these tin pot dictatorships, they centralize the police, which again, it's kind of funny that this is something that we're talking about now here in America, because we're moving very quickly towards a tin pot dictatorship, but that's a story for another day. They want to have one guy who's in charge of all the police in the entire country, so that the local police work for the capital, they work for the dictator, or they work for the ruling party, or they work for the military. Whoever it is that wields power in the capital, they want to control all the police in the entire country. You don't want to have these local sheriffs who might, side with his voters or something like that. That's not a good idea. And so Biden sanctioned the guy in Cuba who's the chief enforcer, the guy who runs the cops. But considering that Cuba has been embargoed by the United States for decades, 60 years now, that is going to have no real effect on him or his life or anything else. So this is a symbolic gesture. But something that Joe Biden said, which may or may not be symbolic, is that the U.S. is going to bolster its efforts to help Cuban dissidents on the ground in the country, which is it's a direct admission, basically, that we're going to see a ramping up of CIA active measures in the country. Now, this is nothing new. The CIA has been trying to destabilize the Cuban regime ever since its inception, pretty much, and they have always failed to do so. However, I think there are some reasons to believe that the Cuban regime is less stable now than it has been in the past, and so there's a chance that these active measures could have more success. But if you're not seeing these protests ramping up, if you're not seeing these protests all over TV, because again, if the CIA was being effective down there, the protests would be a lot bigger, and they would also be communicating them out. The CIA would be having their folks get knowledge of these protests out. You would see more people rising up in the streets like we did a couple weeks ago, which the fact that it petered out tells me that it probably was genuine, because Biden is talking about, like, hey, we're going to ramp this up, we're going to try to do it. It seems like the CIA wants to co-opt this movement, but it's already kind of petered out before they were able to do anything. Nevertheless, I think that we might see more flare-ups like this in Cuba moving forward now that the Castro name is no longer around. There's no more Fidel Castro. He's dead. Raul Castro's out of there. The mystique of the revolution is wearing off. The cult of personality cannot carry the regime for so long after the leader's death. Now we just have the institutional Communist Party, which in and of itself I don't think is enough to appeal to people, especially if they're poor. They might say, hey, you know what? Would I rather be poor and unfree with a guy in charge who I don't really like, or would I rather be poor and free? I think, you get to a point to where there's a critical mass of people who start to favor the poor but free side of the equation. The way you get more people say, hey, I'm happy to be relatively poor and unfree, is if you have a charismatic guy at the top who they say, you know what, I trust that he has his best interest, he has my best interest at heart. Sure, there's a lot of stuff I can't do. Maybe I'm not as successful financially as my cousins in the United States, but hey, I'm okay with this situation. If you got a guy at the top who you don't feel that way about, you're going to start to say, you know what, screw this, let's try something different. Especially as the older generation dies off and the younger generation who didn't grow up under Castro starts to come of age, you're going to see that more and more. So this might be the end of this chapter, but I don't think it's the end of the story. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this. But other than that, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.